Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Joe Sweeney. I'm Associate Director of Admissions for the Notre Dame MBA program. Very excited to have everyone with us today and those folks who are going to be watching the recording later on. I'm excited to be joined today by Michael Crean, one of our career coaches and a veteran of the finance and banking industry. Mike, let you introduce yourself a little bit more.
Thanks again, Joe. As I said, I'm a Senior Associate Director over in the Graduate Business Programs Career Services, and I focus primarily on the finance students, both in corporate finance and the investments area.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about careers in banking and corporate finance. So we've got a full presentation built out. We'll kind of walk through, give you a little bit of scope on everything, and have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Just as a technical note, go ahead and send any questions in through the Q&A feature today, and that'll help us kind of track and answer the questions a little bit more easily than through the chat. So feel free to send in questions via Q&A at any point, and we'll do our best to answer all of them before the hour is up. So with that, I'll turn off our mugs so you can focus on the important thing, which is the information on the slides here, and we'll keep rocking and rolling. So you can see where we're headed here from the presentation today. We'll start by talking a little bit about the banking side of things, and then we'll get a little bit more into the corporate side of things. Talk a little bit about some of the specific activities that Mike's team puts together to support students going through the process here, and where our students have historically landed in these type of roles, what type of roles, what kind of companies, and what some of the ranges look like. So with that, we'll start with investment banking. I know for a lot of folks going through the process, you know, you're just kind of getting up to speed and thinking about the different opportunities for what are out there from MBA careers. So Mike, why don't we start with just kind of an overview of what is investment banking exactly?
Thanks, Joe. Now, certainly when people are considering MBA opportunities, you know, usually the top of the list, and near the top of the list, is investment banking. It's very well known that banks are very pro MBAs. There's a lot of, most institutions hire them for associate programs. But it's important to know what you're getting into. I mean, certainly banks, focus on, helping businesses grow, helping them to raise capital. There's a lot of M&A activity, certainly in the banks. It's rare that MBA interns don't spend a lot of their time working on, M&A transactions, doing a lot of modeling, doing a lot of Excel work, doing a lot of PowerPoint presentations. But obviously there's a lot of, broad range of services that they do for their clients. It just seems like a lot of the times in the summer, our students, or most MBAs, do a lot of work on M&A because that's where a lot of, the activity is in the banks.
So Mike, I think a lot of people hear investment banking and they think they're going to be, actively investing or trading. Talk a little bit about the difference between investment banking and investment management.
Yeah, I mean, and there are a lot of students that come into many MBA programs fairly open to both. Now, when you get down to it, there are pretty less than subtle differences between the two, and recruiters always like it when people have figured out, do they want banking or do they want the investment management side. Investment banking, as we just detailed to a little degree, focuses on a lot of managing businesses themselves, working with corporate clients for the most part, oftentimes working with strategy situations, doing M&A trades. There's certainly, I guess, some of the differences, with investment management, it's more focused on, creating wealth for customers. Now, customers can mean individuals, they can mean corporations, they can mean institutions. Certainly a deep appreciation of the financial markets are very important. Both, I'd say both, even though we have the bullets here, say one is located in the major financial centers, certainly New York, Chicago, the West Coast, Dallas. Investment management, in particular, the major private wealth management roles are oftentimes in the big cities, but certainly if you dig down deeper, there are a lot of investment opportunities in a number of cities, big and small.
All right, so students are getting ready to go into the field. talk to us a little bit about kind of what our incoming students should be thinking about from an academic standpoint. How do you get prepared to move from kind of whatever else you're doing, whether it's being a CPA or being in the military or baking cupcakes, how do you get yourself prepared to get into investment banking?
Yeah. Funny enough, I mean, a lot of people think that you have to have a hardcore finance background to be an iBanker. And I just look to what happens at the undergrad level, especially with people going into analyst programs. I mean, a number of top U.S. institutions don't have business undergraduate degrees, yet a lot of these students, do find their way into iBanking because they're sharp, well-spoken, they interview well, they network well, they're good in a group setting, they're good teammates. And even at the MBA level, I mean, we have students, and Joe just alluded to, a lot of people who come into banking do it from, coming from the veteran staff, former military. Just last year, we had one of our students who was a former cake baker before she came to Notre Dame and wound up in New York in an iBank. So there's all sorts of disciplines that you can come from before ND. Now, when you get here, obviously you have to figure out early on, what your story is and what you can sell to recruiters at the banks. And those recruiters can be our alums as well. Now, you'll have coursework here to supplement all the effort you're doing, but I think that, having strong, certainly financial tools is important, but being able to tell your story and convince people why you want banking is surprisingly a big part of the deal, because they know that certain skills and technical skills you're going to pick up while you're in the program. And this goes for any institution.
So one of the things that we offer from kind of a curriculum standpoint here within the program are concentrations. So concentrations are generally a way for students to go ahead and have a little bit more structure around their coursework as they go through the MBA program. There's a lot of elective flexibility going through. So, having a concentration in corporate finance or in investments is a great way to kind of make sure you're checking those boxes, hitting those skills that Mike mentioned. Students can have two different concentrations as they go through the MBA program. So a lot of times folks that are headed to investment banking or into corporate finance will do both the finance and the investments academic concentrations as a way to bone up their skills for that. The other big one that I think a lot of folks are looking at these days too is business analytics as a secondary concentration. All of those analytical skills and tool sets are really important, really for any MBA career that you go into. But so much of the banking sector is driven by that kind of high level data analysis as well. So that's a great skill set to be able to have to go for. So one of the other things that's kind of built into the program is actually getting some face time with some of the banks and kind of getting a little bit more firsthand experience. Mike, I know your team runs the Wall Street Trek every year. Tell us a little bit more about kind of how that works and what some of the benefit is.
Okay, sure will, Joe. We've done this trek for a number of years now. And there's a couple of things that people have to consider when they look at the trek. I mean, given the size and location of the program, the truth is we're not a core school to a number of banks, especially in New York, but we are still, I would argue, an important school, largely because of the alumni that we have on Wall Street. And these alums are both undergraduate and MBA, so it doesn't really matter to us. Now, in the October vacation, we get students and we head to New York, and we spend a good chunk of the week, going around, getting presentations, having a chance to meet with alums, usually during the day, and students are welcome and actually encouraged to either come early or stay longer to network with the alums while they're in New York, because it is a major part of the recruiting process. As I said, if the banks aren't coming out here, and there are a few, but mostly Midwest banks that will come to campus, we have to go to the banks, and the alumni are a good source of making that connection between us and the recruiting teams at a number of institutions in New York. And I would argue it's actually extremely important for students who want to do iBanking in New York to go on the trek, because the alums basically serve as vetters, if you will, and they get to know the students, and then they would make recommendations to the recruiting team and get students either set up for phone interviews, or on a few occasions we'll get a fast pass to super days. We do limit it to first-year students. Every year there's a handful of second years and 1 years that say they want to come, but this is really a combination of timing and the requests of our alums, because by the time we go to visit the firms in New York, full-time recruiting is pretty much done anyway. And I also should point out, even though this sheet just talks about Wall Street, given our location, we do encourage and try to organize treks, or mini treks, if you will, for our students to go to Chicago on Fridays, which is, like most schools, typically a no-class day. So it's pretty easy. You can zip up to the Loop in Chicago in an hour and a half from here. So we do have a number of students that want banking, but really would prefer to be in the Midwest, whether that's Chicago, Minneapolis, Cleveland. So to that extent, it's important for those students to get up to Chicago when they can.
I think that's a great point. A lot of you listening know that I also went through the program. I was class of 2012. A lot of my classmates that went into banking, we had a number that ended up in New York on Wall Street, but we had quite a few that ended up in, Chicago, Minneapolis, Atlanta, as well, with other banks. So, most of your big banks are going to have multiple different offices. So if you've got a geographic preference along the way, a lot of times there are going to be some different options that are going to be available through that. So it's not 100% New York. There's, of course, a great opportunity in New York because there's a lot of big banks and a lot of money that rolls through there. But there are some good opportunities around the country as well. So as students are going through and thinking about, actually applying, let's talk a little bit about kind of specifically what the recruiters are looking for when the kind of the rubber meets the road and they're actually getting down interviewing candidates.
Yeah, man. Obviously, this is almost overly obvious that they want smart people. They want students who are good communicators. Attention to detail oftentimes gets overlooked, and the banks really have no room for sloppy people, for people who make mistakes. And you can be off occasionally and have a bad day, but that's just not going to cut it with these financial institutions. Now, having previous exposure to banking or something in the financial field is beneficial, but certainly not required. And the only other thing I would add to this sheet is we oftentimes will go to New York with students not from the U.S., and a lot of firms out there do sponsor for banking. Now, with that being said, they will sponsor strong students, but communication skills are certainly vital here. I mean, I like to say there's students with strong English skills and very good English skills, but then there's banking English. So I think it's important when students come in here that they do realize that as very solid as their English, both written and oral skills are, it takes almost a stepped up level for banks. So it's a challenge for some students.
All right. So as we think about kind of that career aspect of it, talk a little bit about kind of how folks will move through. You can see here that this is a list of some of the starting companies and starting titles of our class of 2017 grads. I feel like for investment banking, pretty much everybody comes in as an associate right off, and there's little differences from one bank to another, but for the most part, it's more or less the same type of work, right?
Yeah, the only exception to that might be if we do have some of you may be considering our 5-year MBA engineering/science program. So those students are younger with less work experience, so they would they always go into the bank analyst programs at those institutions.
All right, and then kind of looking a couple of years down the road, because the rest of the progression is important. So again, class of 2012, these are some of my classmates that are out there. At this point, we're 6 years in, and so most folks are kind of up to the VP level. Some of them are with the same banks that they've been with since graduation, right out of the program. A couple of them have switched banks along the way, but still managed to maintain that progression. And then, every once in a while, you get a couple of folks that, specialize into something that's a little bit more particular, or, move kind of more primarily into the trading realm as well. But, for the most part, most of the folks that are staying in 5, 6, 7 years in investment banking at this point, kind of a natural progression is to get up to that VP level, and kind of stay with that core bank. There's not a lot of folks that switch banks, I don't think, too much, or maybe move to something a little
certainly
smaller.
the first few years, students realize, or our grads realize, that they just have to put your head down and work hard. And as the closer you get to that VP level, you get to that fork in the road. I mean, you either decide that I like the institution, the pay is getting better, my hours are getting better, I can see my family a little bit more. If you don't want banking, maybe you start to consider either going to the private sector route, or working with clients, or go down the private equity route if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, if there is a change, typically it's something to do with the bank itself, or cuts. But a lot of our students, I think, realize they just have to just stay put for a little while before they make any moves.
So I know one of the things that's always very attractive in the banking realm is the compensation that goes along with it. So you can see here where some of the internship and full-time levels come in. My understanding is that this is fairly standard, across banks for the most part.
Yeah, and I think that's one reason we're not shy about putting numbers up, because these are fairly well-known numbers within the industry. I mean, everything kind of starts in New York and then filters down to the banks in other cities. Even the numbers we've listed here are potentially going to be stale, because as this summer period ended, many of the bigger banks in New York were raising their average starting salary. And that's usually a situation that develops because a lot of boutique banks and smaller banks are starting to nip at the heels of the bulge brackets and offering some pretty attractive starting salaries. So usually every few years, it's not every 1 or 2, but maybe every 3 to 5 years, the banks will come together and decide that, hey, we need to all get on the same page here and offer more attractive starting salaries, and obviously leads to better signing bonuses, etc. The banks are one of those sectors, like consulting, that tend to offer internship salaries, which are basically 1/12 of the annual salary. So students get a pretty good sense that obviously they're going to be well paid during the summer, which is necessary given sometimes how much the rents are in New York or San Francisco. But and a lot of these numbers are the same for wealth management as well. So I think that we haven't spoken a lot about it here, but most of the major institutions like Goldman and JP Morgan view their wealth management associates very much like they do the iBanking associates in terms of the way they're compensated.
All right. And, kind of the follow-on to that, we've thrown out a couple of these banks already as examples for other things, but you can see here some of the top employers for Notre Dame graduates. Again, these tend to be firms that are, fairly consistent hires. A lot of firms where we've got good alumni that are, good advocates for folks coming through the program as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, we do tend to spend a lot of our effort with certain banks that I think are very close to us and really look at our students quite favorably. There are obviously some major names that might be on your bucket lists out there, but we encourage students to try to make connections in those firms. But you have to remember that a lot of banks have a lot of core schools, and we have to battle where we can. But a lot of these institutions here, if you work hard, you can wind up at these places.
All right, so we're going to switch gears here a little bit. I've been talking a lot about banking so far. Let's talk a little bit about corporate finance. It's a little bit of a different animal with a couple of different considerations, but I know a lot of times folks kind of start in one and maybe migrate to the other, or vice versa, or they're just kind of at this point in the process, maybe just thinking something in finance in general. So let's talk a little bit about corporate finance. What's corporate finance? Why is it different?
Yeah, and I think that one commercial I would say is, we spend a lot of time, as Joe mentioned, on banking, because I think in some people's minds it's so sexy. But our position in iBanking is, I like to say we're a singles hitter. We'll get one in this bank, one in that bank, maybe two in that bank, and because of the size of the program, and we're not looking at the numbers of a Wharton or a Booth or Columbia or NYU, but in corporate finance, I'd say that we are, I think, actually pretty strong there, and I think that if you look at our reputation, a lot of people will talk about how well we do in corporate finance, not just in the Midwest, but I think on a national basis. But corporate finance is, as we say on the slide here, the focusing on the capital structure, a firm's financial resources. You're still trying to help the company increase its value. There are roles both in controller side, treasury side, so you can be working with budgeting, FP&A, forecasts. On the other side, you can be working with the banks. You're working with investors, so you can helping to raise capital for the firm too. And the positions we tend to get are, maybe the average title is probably senior financial analyst, but depending on the firm, you can be located in any number of spots, either within the corporate office of a firm or perhaps out in one of the operating units. So it covers a lot more ground than banking does.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Kind of outside of the banking realm, a lot of times the titles can be a little deceiving. So sometimes, so that's an important piece of your homework as you're going through and looking at different companies to see what that responsibility entails and what kind of impact you can have. Because a lot of times, the title might sound the same, but the responsibilities are pretty different. So again, we'll kind of set this up the same way. So from an academic standpoint, a lot of this is very similar to the investment banking piece. Again, a lot of students looking at this are going through either that corporate finance or investments concentration. A lot of times it's both. And a lot of times they're throwing on business analytics. Again, that's such a valuable skill set to be able to have in this day and age for anything. And then, from a skills standpoint, again, fairly similar here too, between the two paths. Getting into, kind of what the recruiters specifically are looking for. Again, it hits on a couple of those things. Like maybe call out some of the differences for us.
Yeah,
here.
I mean, these slides are always funny because all sectors that we work with, I mean, they're looking for smart people with financial acumen. I think what's often overlooked here is that, yeah, it's great to have an accounting background. They obviously, corporate finance recruiters love CPAs or people who've worked as auditors or worked for the Big Four, but it's still all about communication. It's the ability to work with teams, work across functions. Depending on what your role, you may not be working with a lot of outside clients, but you're going to be working with a lot of inside senior management. So you certainly have to have the ability to plan your day, to obviously be very detailed in your work. If you're working with internal folks, you have to be able to be a good presenter, make your case, defend your case. If you're working in maybe the treasury side where you're working with banking folks or working with investors or rating agencies, you have to make sure you have the ability to communicate that message to the outside world too. So it's not as, a lot of it is more personality driven, I think, between the two, corporate finance and banking and investments.
All right, so taking a look at the career progression here, again, you kind of touched on before, a lot of folks go in as a senior financial analyst or some kind of financial analyst. The types of companies that folks go into kind of right away here tends to be a lot more of your kind of big brand name companies. You've got Amazon, which is usually the -- 1 hirer for us, at least for the last couple of years. You've got big companies like Ecolab, ExxonMobil, Ford. And then you've got some stuff that's a little bit more niche. Healthcare has been kind of a popular spot for a lot of folks looking at MBAs. I'd say that's probably a little bit less of a traditional pipeline for us, but definitely opportunities there as well. So it focuses a little bit more into kind of corporations here as opposed to the pipeline into the regular investment banks here.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Joe, is that we haven't really touched upon leadership programs, and that cuts across a lot of different sectors, but there are a lot of the firms, a lot of the recruiters, even the ones we're going to mention today, the roles people are taking could be very well part of a leadership rotation program where you're going to spend 8 to 12 months over 2 to 3 per rotation over 2 to 3 years, getting a broad sense of what goes on in the finance area of a given firm. Occasionally there may be general leadership programs of which a finance stop may be along the way, but some students like the idea of kind of easing into a company by getting pieces of it months at a time. I mean, there are some that want to come in. No, I know exactly what I want. This is the area I want. I'm going to focus on it. But there are a lot of folks who they may not have come from a finance background. They don't have a lot of depth and breadth. So I think the leadership program is a great way for them to see a lot of the company, and then when they're done, figure out where they want to go full time.
Absolutely, and I think that shows a little bit too in some of the career progressions here. I think it's a little less standard when you're getting in a corporate finance role than in some of those investment banking roles. So again, looking at some of my classmates here, where they ended up, you've got a little bit larger smattering of companies here. You've got big insurance, you've got companies that work with financial instruments like Capital One. You've got some startup companies in here as well. So there's a little bit of a different approach that you can take here. And of course, there's good progressions within a lot of those starting companies as well. A lot of folks will come in as a financial analyst for Amazon and end up leading whole business units, things like that along the way. All right, so taking a look from a placement standpoint, there's a little bit more variation here from a corporate finance standpoint than in the investment banking realm. The other thing, too, that I think is important to talk about here is kind of how the recruiting works. With the banks, it's a lot of groundwork. There's a lot more on-campus recruiting opportunities for corporate finance, based on some of those relationships too. Maybe Mike, you can kind of touch on a little bit of how that works and how that's different here.
Yeah, I think if you look at just from a timing standpoint, I mean, we're really sort of winding down a lot of the on-campus recruiting that we have for full-time students, both the 2-year and then the 1-year programs, which is pretty active in September and October. Then it drops off a bit, but so there are a lot of students at all institutions that have to source their jobs off campus. Internships, on-campus recruiting is very big in January, February, and it drops off after that. Now, to supplement the on-campus recruiting, you do have a lot of national conferences, which many of you might be aware of. So diversity conferences, such as National Black or Prospanica, the Vets Conference, Reaching Out, Forte. Several of these conferences are actually open to all MBA students, and it's a great way. For example, last week, several of my colleagues were at National Black in Detroit, where you can get a large number, I forget what the number was, 150, 200 companies that aren't necessarily going to be coming to any campus or your campus, but your students can get out there. And we were very fortunate this year that a lot of these conferences were in the greater Midwest, so many of our students were able to drive. They didn't have to fly. We actually had a bus for National Black, so it opens up a lot of doors that might not be there, where you can get face-to-face conversations and interviews. So we've been very big at promoting these conferences the last couple of years, because it's important for our students to see a lot more companies than the ones that just come on campus.
I think the other thing that's important to reemphasize here too is, anybody that's not coming on campus, if you can leverage the alumni network and kind of get a foot in the door, a lot of times that will create an opportunity as well. Or if you're looking for something that's a little bit more niche, that doesn't have a lot of MBA hiring opportunities in general, that can be a good way too. Again, my experience isn't in corporate finance, but from an industry standpoint, I was looking at an industry that didn't hire a lot of MBAs, but was able to leverage the network to get in. A lot of times it's going to be true for some finance roles too. If you've got, a company that, maybe is interested in 1 or 2 MBAs in a year that doesn't have kind of your traditional pipeline, the network's a great way to be able to supplement. But for the ones that do have a little bit of a better pipeline, again, you can see where some of the top employers come from corporate finance standpoint. Again, there are a lot more companies than this that hire both in the MBA space and hire our grads. But these are some of the probably more recognizable brand names and a couple of the larger employers in the last year or two.
Yeah, we have some names, and I mean, we can change this chart almost every year because there are going to be some times when some of our close relationships, like United Airlines or P&G or Fidelity, American Airlines, AT&T, Nationwide, they'll come in and interview and make offers, and sometimes the offers aren't accepted. So, we're like anyone else. We go through these cycles that where we get a lot of people in one year and maybe not as many the next.
All right, so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A here in the next couple minutes. I want to touch on a couple other just administrative things from an admissions standpoint, and then we'll get back into your questions. So feel free to fire away any questions related to corporate finance, investment banking, or the career search process in either of those. But before we get there, I want to put a couple of things on your radar from an admissions and a process standpoint. First are a couple of upcoming events. Our team travels a lot around the country, so we've got off-campus events for a group called Inside the MBA, and that hits most of the major metros throughout the year. We've been to a couple of them already, but we've got a bunch more. We'll be in Minneapolis and Chicago next week, be in DC, Philly the week after that, Raleigh, Charlotte, and Atlanta in early November, and then Dallas, Austin, and Houston in mid-November as well. Exact dates are up on the website. We'll also be back in Chicago on October 20th for the QS World Tour, so that's a great opportunity to connect with some of the folks from our team and usually some of our alums. If we've got any vets with us today, Service Academy Career Conference in San Antonio, I'll be present for that as well. Again, we've had a lot of our military veterans end up in both of these sectors, in both corporate finance and in investment banking. So happy to talk to you about that if you're down there as well. If you do find yourself on campus, we've got a couple opportunities coming up for our Football Friday information sessions. Those are in the afternoon before every home football game. So we've got 2 more home football games, October 13th against Pittsburgh and November 10th against Florida State. Feeling pretty good about both of those right now. So it should be fun if you find yourself on campus. Stop by and see us for that. And you're all also invited for our Domer for a Day event. So that's kind of a full day on campus to get a little bit of a sense of what it's like to be a student. There'll be full presentations on different things related to life in the program. You have a good opportunity to interact with some of the current students as well. So all of that information and more is on the website. Put a couple more webinars on your radar. We'll do a number more with the Career Services team throughout this month and next, but our next one is going to be application focused. We do have our round 1 application coming up on October the 16th, so we want to give everyone a chance to do a little Q&A about their app beforehand. So our team will actually do 2 webinars next Thursday on October 11th, one at the same time, 12 Eastern, and one at 7 p.m. Eastern. So hopefully you can make one of those. Again, all the webinars will be recorded and put up on the web, a day or 2 after. So if you miss one and you want to come back and watch, those will be up there. And of course, if you have any application questions, you can always just send those into the admissions team. One final thing, and then we'll get to your questions, so keep sending those in. For attending the webinar today, we want to throw an application fee waiver your way. So as you're submitting your application, if you type in GBPI, that'll go ahead and automatically waive your application fee as a thank you for engaging with us today. So, all right, we'll get to the Q&A here. Send in your questions and we'll tick them off here. So first and foremost, how much more difficult is it for somebody to find opportunities in finance or in banking based on age? If you're a little bit older than a traditional student, how does that impact the process? Typical MBA comes in around 27, 28, 29. If somebody is a little bit older than that, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and it's not an infrequent one either. And I guess it's also a tough one to answer because Joe correctly pointed out that the average student coming in is going to be like 27 or 8 or so when they start. And it may sound corny, but it's not necessarily if you are in your mid-30s, we'll just argue. But I think if it were more than that, there might be an awkwardness, especially with banking, because like if your peer group is 10 plus years gap, a lot of times companies might not want to play with that dynamic. But if someone has a very strong work background, and I would argue that our students are probably a little younger than some of other schools, maybe certainly some ranked schools, which tends to take maybe older students who are looking to make a career change. But the only time I've seen age as maybe turning into a struggle is maybe someone who has a 4 in front of their age, where it's I'm not even trying to be a little polite here, but I just think that some companies can always find an excuse for saying that they're not the right match. But I think someone who is in their 30s, who has practical work experience, and then does all the things we said in the last 30 minutes, networks well, prepares well, comes across as a very good communicator. You could argue that to someone who's 23 or 4, are they too young too? That we don't get that question a whole lot, but we also have young students who are very mature, great communicators, technically strong, and as long as a company doesn't have a set in stone minimum number of years work experience, they're going to be considered just as often as the 28-year-old is. So is it a little tougher? Yeah, certainly on the margin it will be, but I don't think that age it doesn't slam a whole lot of doors.
So I know one of the questions that we get a lot, and you touched on the international aspect of this a little bit, but talk a little bit about kind of sponsorship in both of these fields. Are there companies that are willing to do it, companies that are not willing to do it? For international students looking at getting into different types of finance roles,
Mm-hmm.
What are the best opportunities? Where is it a little bit tougher?
Yeah, when we have orientation for our international students through the years, we're always just even trying to get upfront ideas about where students want to go. And as you might imagine, there's always been an emphasis or an interest in consulting, just given the fact that a lot of those firms sponsor. That has shifted a lot towards tech now, because you're finding some firms, especially smaller ones, aren't afraid to sponsor. And then finance has always been somewhere in the middle. We have a number of our companies that a number of our recruiters that come here, but not a huge number. It's certainly a percentage of the overall pool. Companies like Ecolab and American Airlines and Emerson. But it seems like every year we do find one company that is pulling back, and and typically it's not an issue of expense or administration. It's more an issue of having someone they've hired and they've brought on board, and then they lose the lottery. So they feel that, okay, we've invested all this time and money, and unless we're a global firm, we don't have anything to do. We don't have any place to put this person. So the individual has to go home, no matter to their home country. So I think that's starting to scare a few people. Banking is somewhere in the middle too. And actually, with both banking and corporate finance, we have 3 pools. We have institutions we know just won't sponsor. They never have. They probably never will. We have others that are very open, very globally focused, and that will make every effort to bring in international students. And then we have some that they may not advertise it, but we learn every year that for the right student, they will make the exception, even if they don't advertise it. Banking is tough because there again, the skill sets, the communication skill sets are really what triggers this. So you can be a 780 and a 4.0 in your home country, and you could have pretty strong English, but a lot of our bankers, they're very impatient, to be blunt, and we try to get to as many banks when we do the Wall Street trek that we know will sponsor, because oftentimes we'll have a blend of U.S. and non-U.S. students on the trek. We can't see all institutions that sponsor, but we try to be as fair as we can to make sure that the students are given an opportunity to network with firms where they will have sponsorship opportunities.
The other thing I'll say too, just very briefly for for international students, is a lot of times they're good opportunities internationally with some multinationals as well. I was in Beijing earlier this month and had dinner with a couple of my classmates from class of 2012. One's doing investment banking for a bank in China, and the other one is launching the consumer finance division for Tesla in China right now. So, there's some cool opportunities out there, in other markets too. Obviously the banking sector in the U.S. is pretty robust, but, there's a lot of good financial centers out there. And frankly, a lot of the big banks are going to be, have more of a global presence anyway. Another question here, and I've got a couple thoughts on this. Mike, you can add some as well. One of the most common ways for students to get involved in the activities in NDIGI. So for those who don't know, NDIGI is the Institute for Global Investing. That's one of the centers here in the business school. So honestly, one of the easiest ways is just to kind of pop into their office and say, hey, I'm here. What can I do? What can I get involved in? There's a number of different things that they do. They put together some specific programming where they'll engage with students from, like a workshop standpoint. A lot of times they'll host things for folks at different levels. One of the big initiatives that they were running earlier this summer is a group called Girls Who Invest, or Women Who Invest. And they have undergrad college students from all across the country, women who are interested in getting into the investment space. So there's a lot of moving parts to something like that, which is a nice way to get involved there. We actually have a brand new director for NDIGI who's just getting up to speed. So she'll have a little bit more kind of insight and direction into some of those opportunities as well. Mike, you might be a little bit more familiar.
Yeah, we've tried to develop a pretty good relationship with the IGI folks who are just downstairs from where Joe and I are sitting. And I think that when the Institute first started, there was no hiding the fact that they were going to do a lot of work and focus a lot on the undergraduate program. But we've spent some time working for them, and I think they realize that it's important for our students to be involved in the speaker series they have. IGI now has initiated a visiting fellows program where they have alums coming in to meet with students to advise and mentor them in banking, asset management, private wealth management, PE, hedge fund sectors. And to that end, they're carving out all of their schedules to have our MBA students meet with them specifically. So I think that was a good step forward too. So I think that with each year, as their programming picks up, and they're going to have the MBAs involved more and more.
All right, next question here, a little more specific. Somebody who's working in risk and compliance in banking already, thinking about opportunities for the regulatory side post MBA. What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a little tougher, only in that it's not. I guess I wouldn't call it mainstream, but every year we have students who come from. It's fine. We have a lot of students who come from either banks or mutual funds, from maybe the middle of back office, and want to move further to the front, be more client facing. I think that's you don't have a lot of regulatory agencies who seem to be very visible yet. At the same time, if you go to some of these diversity conferences, you tend to see them at those events because they get more traffic. They're not necessarily going to see a lot of these regulatory groups, whether it's from New York or even Washington, out on college campuses, doing heavy recruiting because of the numbers and the cost. But I think if you see them at various career fairs and diversity conferences, they're more visible there. Now, there again, we always play the card here of, if you find Notre Dame alums at any of these institutions, it's a lot easier to crack a door open. And I'm not going to repeat what Joe had said before, because it is such a big part of what we do. And especially when you get away into smaller names where you're not going to have a robust recruiting effort. And I think the average person needs to just realize that not every institution in America has a huge budget to go out and recruit 50 MBAs a year. There are a lot of companies that wake up Christmas morning and decide, oh, I guess I should think about either getting interns or hiring full-time in the spring. So that's why a lot of this stuff happens after Christmas. And we try to get our students and, prospective students to realize that it is not all a September, October game. But my long-winded point is a lot of these companies do not, go out and hit the road, and they will start, perhaps even just posting jobs in the, first and second quarter.
All right, next question. So are one-year students at a disadvantage at all when it comes to obtaining jobs within the industry without having that internship experience? So I'll kind of start off here and let Mike finish up. So from an investment banking standpoint, it's pretty much, it's very difficult. Let's put it that way, if not near impossible, to get into investment banking without the internship. That's a pretty well-defined pipeline from that standpoint. For corporate finance, we see a lot more of our one-year students end up in corporate finance roles. The other big thing that goes into that is what your background is prior to joining the one-year MBA program. The 1 year is very difficult to do kind of a hard career switch, or if you don't have a good business background, to be able to leverage that into this type of role on the back end. So, that person that's going from being the cake baker, that doesn't work in a 1 year program. If you're in financial services, or if you're a CPA and you're looking to get into corporate finance, that's a little bit of a different story. Mike, anything?
Yeah, no, this is a very popular question, and one we're not afraid to tackle. And I think Joe hit the highlights, at least from banking. We'll just touch upon that briefly, and then we'll move on. Is with iBanking in particular, it's just tough. I mean, they depend so much on the internship. They need to have seen how you're going to perform over 10 months. Now, if you came from a commercial bank and had either a lending or a credit background or client background, that's helpful, but you still have to find the open slots. I mean, there are so few slots that are open to a program like Notre Dame in the fall. And we sometimes have students, even though the vast majority of our banking interns do get full-time offers because they work hard. On occasion, you'll have someone that, for whatever reason, doesn't get an offer and still wants to try the banking route. So they spend, much of the fall trying to find those open spots that are out there, but it's like searching for crumbs. It's very difficult to do. Otherwise, the 1 year program, I mean, the good news is, and we're seeing it right now because we've had a lot of companies in the last couple of weeks, a lot of companies are intrigued to see the 1 years because they didn't see them last spring during the internship cycle. So when they come back in the fall, and a good number of our companies do recruit full-time and for interns. So when they come back in September, October, they're actually looking forward to seeing these 1 years who typically have pretty solid work experience. And by definition, the 1 year program is supposed to be students who have business backgrounds, aren't looking to be career changers. Now, the struggle would be for people who might be career shifters. It's a subtle term, but and without the internship, sometimes a company, they're less likely to take a chance on a career shifter. Even the veterans, it's not ideal for them in the 1 year program, and many international students, it's tough because lacking that internship, it's a more of an uphill battle.
All right. So when students are going out for the Wall Street trek in October, what does the schedule look like? Is that just popping in and out of banks? Are there good opportunities for networking? What does that structure look like a little bit?
I wish it was popping in and out, but it's a lot more. It's more logistical. I won't say nightmare than challenging people think, because you have to set up
on Mike's end.
on my end, sorry. You have to set up. Now the good news is most of our alums know we're coming every year about this time. So when we do reach out to them, it's more a question of they kind of go on autopilot and they get the room set up for us. And we like to stress to people, we're the ones that are doing all the work. The students get on planes. We fly out from Indiana and show up, and so all we really ask for them is to give us an hour in a conference room and have some alums and maybe HR there to talk about the bank, talk about the application process if that's appropriate. And the more and more we do this, the model is a little different now. We don't necessarily have long presentations and a lot of slides, which bore a lot of people in this generation. So we tend to have more introductory comments, and we do a lot more networking where a good bank will come in with a number of our students, and not just our alums, but they'll have some other students there as well, and other associates as well, so they can spend some time getting to know our students. We do make sure we have time during the week, even though the days can be pretty full. We do have pockets of free time where we encourage students to go have coffee with maybe someone they met the other day. Or the other thing we oftentimes want people to know beforehand is the successful students tend to do this trip to New York multiple times. It's great to go there for the Wall Street Trek, but the banks in particular do like to see your face again. Now, we've had students go 5 or 6 times, and that gets expensive, and it gets time consuming, and it puts pressure on your studies. But usually students will leave here on a Thursday after class and go to New York and try to have as many either coffee chats or just networking conversations or lunches on Friday that they can, or maybe they'll do it over a holiday weekend. So that's an added dimension that a lot of people need to consider.
Yeah, and logistically there, for folks that don't know, we only have class Monday through Thursday, so you never have class on Friday. So kind of when you're in that core season, we know that the recruiting piece is such an essential part of the program. So Fridays are kind of intentionally kept clear to be able to allow you a little bit more freedom to get off campus, get out there, do a little bit of that. There aren't a ton, but there are a couple direct flights from South Bend and Newark. It's not my favorite. It's an early morning flight, and I don't love those, but it is effective. So that helps make it a little bit easier from a location standpoint. But again, that legwork goes a long way with a lot of these folks. So a lot of people that are super gung-ho for investment banking will go ahead and put in the time. So. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. Again, thank you for joining us so much. I've got a couple more webinars, a couple that are going to be program level, a couple that are going to be career specific over the next 2 months as we get into kind of the core of the application cycle and the heart of your decision-making process. If you have other questions for us, either about what we talked about today or other things that are specific or general about the program, please feel free to reach out and let us know. We'll do our best to get back with you as quickly as we can. And the other thing I always recommend for folks that are looking at the program, reach out to some of the students that are in the program right now via contact a student on the website. So, you can get a little bit of a different perspective on what Mike and I talked to today from some of the folks that are going through, their career search in finance and in investment banking as well. I guess it'll be pretty similar, but it's nice to get multiple perspectives on that and get a sense of what kind of backgrounds they were coming from as well. So if you go on the website, there's a section right on the main page for the 2-year MBA program and for the 1-year MBA program called Contact a Student. You can click into and see profiles for folks that are in the program. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Again, if you've got extra questions, feel free to reach out. But we appreciate you being with us today and look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.
Thank you.